Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Multiculturalism, right or wrong? That's the subject of a big ongoing debate in British society. For a long time, the broad consensus seems to have been that multiculturalism is in general a positive thing, a social benefit. But now increasingly, the political right and sections of liberal and left opinion are questioning the multicultural consensus, arguing that it has a downside as well, that the right to be different, that plurality and diversity have their limits. With me to discuss the whole question of multiculturalism, its pros and cons, is Johann Hari, independent columnist and frequent writer on these issues. I noticed, Johann, that recently you had a large piece in The Independent where you highlighted your own view that multiculturalism really has gone too far, and that in particular it's betraying the rights of women. I mean, what brought you to this conclusion?
Well, there's been a string of cases in Germany recently that have, I think, shown the problem with the doctrine of multiculturalism, and I think it's important to define the doctrine before we talk about it. I think multiculturalism is the doctrine that the state should actively encourage immigrants to retain the values of the culture from which they came as a positive good in and of itself. And I think you can see how flawed that is if you look at the recent cases in Germany.
Before you go into that, can I just ask you, that's an interpretation, sure. Other people might say it isn't about the state, dictating or encouraging people to retain their cultural identities and practices, but it's about more accepting the right of different cultures to, be different.
See, I think you need to define this in terms of individuals and the wider society, not about chopping people up into cultures. Because if you chop people up into cultures, a young gay Muslim man, well, what culture does he belong to? He clearly doesn't feel he belongs in a Muslim culture where 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds who are Muslim in this country, according to a recent opinion poll, believe he should be killed. And the problem with multiculturalism, as it's been interpreted, and I think as it will always be interpreted, is that it implies that immigrants belong to one homogeneous block, that they are all divided up, and you, immigrant, belong in this block, and that block is defined by the values of the most reactionary and unpleasant men in that community. We're not talking about the values of, when we talk about the values of the Muslim community, people do not talk about the Muslim girls where I live in Brick Lane who, I see coming out of school, taking off their hijab, putting on makeup and going off to snog their boyfriends. We don't talk about the young Muslim gay men who are shunned and then, find liberation elsewhere. No, we're talking about reactionary mullahs who are part of the Muslim community, a quite repulsive part, and not the attractive parts of the Muslim community. So I just think this whole way of looking at immigrants is wrong. We should speak about individuals and their rights, and we should speak about the needs of the wider society. But I don't believe in carving people up in this way. I don't think it's helpful for immigrants, I don't think it's helpful for us.
Do you think it's perhaps not entirely appropriate to, interpret multiculturalism as being specifically an immigrant ethnic issue? Because surely you could say that, the lesbian gay community was part of a multicultural society.
So again,
or you could say, other minority faiths like, Buddhists were part of this multicultural diversity.
Well, there are relatively few non-immigrant Buddhists in this country. But no, I think clearly it has been applied to immigrants. If what you're talking about is diversity, then of course I'm in favour of it. I don't want everyone to be, little mini clones of, 1950s vision of a family. But the point is not. The point is not. People are naturally diverse. People will naturally be different. The question is, what should the government do about that? The government needs to set a framework of shared values and delimit where those shared values end. Those shared values end where you believe in killing gay people or imprisoning women in their home or all sorts of things. So the point is we articulate shared values, and the government doesn't need to worry about people being different. People will naturally be different. They'll naturally flourish in different ways. Of course, the police need to be sensitive to that. I mean, I'm all in favour of, the police, when they go into a mosque, should take off their shoes. I'm not in favour of being gratuitously insulting to people. But it's not the business of the government to encourage difference. Individuals will be different in the thousand wonderful ways they always will be. The government's job is to establish a framework of shared values and delimit those shared values in defence of the weakest. So if I can go back to the German case, which is a good example of how this doctrine has gone so badly wrong. There have been a series of findings by the German courts that have effectively relegated Muslim women to third-class citizenship on the basis of their culture, in inverted commas. The best example is a woman called Zainab, who was a German citizen. She'd come to Germany from Algeria as a young woman, as a child, and she was being horrifically abused by her husband. He was beating the hell out of her, basically. She had 2 kids. She was 26 years old, and she went to the German courts. Because in Germany, you have to be separated for 2 years before you're granted a divorce automatically. And she'd only been separated from him for a few months, but she just wanted him out of her life. So she presented all the evidence that she was being beaten. The police had been called many times. They'd witnessed evidence of her being beaten. The court agreed that she'd been beaten. And the German judge, a German female judge, not from an immigrant community, said in her verdict, I accept the evidence that you are a victim of domestic violence, but I've looked at the Quran, which is the centre of your culture, and you as a Muslim woman should have expected this. She read out the surah from the Quran that says that it's perfectly permissible, indeed recommended, to beat a woman who is unruly. And so the judge said, so I'm not granting a divorce. This, is a classic example. Now, with the logic of multiculturalism, how can you critique that? This judge was saying, we're a country of many cultures, she belongs to that culture, these are the rules of her culture, fair enough. Now, what I say is that irrespective of what a culture says, firstly, it disregards the fact that cultures are always diverse and warring with each other. It may be the culture of an elderly, bigoted imam to say women should be beaten. It wasn't this woman's culture to say she should be beaten. It's not the culture of any woman to say that she should be beaten. It's not the culture of gay people to be killed. So clearly, it ignored the diversity within the Muslim community, among Muslims generally, who should be considered as citizens primarily. But also, it was a fundamental betrayal of the human rights upon which the German constitution is now thankfully built. And it's important to bear in mind, this is not some kind of freakish exception in the German legal system. I just want to give you a few examples. I want to get the wording right. Der Spiegel magazine did a brilliant expose of this. Indeed, the only Minister for Integration in Germany, Armin Laschet, said, this is just one example of many of how the courts are fighting against Muslim women. There was a recent case where a Lebanese German man strangled his daughter and then beat her unconscious with a bludgeon because she didn't want to marry the man he had picked out for her. He was only sentenced to probation on the grounds that his cultural background dictated that he felt he had the right to control his daughter. A Turkish-German guy who stabbed his wife to death in Frankfurt was given the lowest possible sentence because the judge said the murdered woman had violated his male honour derived from his Anatolian moral concepts. I could go on and on with examples like this. In fact, there was a particularly horrific one, which I think is incredibly revealing of how multiculturalism actually relegates recent immigrants or people whose parents were immigrants to a third-class status. There was a move among, I think it was in Frankfurt, Muslim parents withdrawing their daughters from school trips. They said there's a rule in the Quran, which obviously was set up 9th century AD, which said that a girl can only be taken a certain distance, I think it's 80 miles from her father, if she's unmarried, because that's as far as a camel could travel in one day. And these parents said, well, you're taking her further than a camel could travel in a day, therefore we don't want her on this trip. And the girl wanted to go, the young girl wanted to go on these school trips, and the school suddenly realised if they gave in on this, an awful lot of girls would suddenly be debarred from going on school trips. So the school went to court, and the judge said, no, if we already have a law that says that if you are brain damaged, you have to be accompanied on a school trip by your parents. I don't see how this is any different. These girls are clearly analogous to the brain damaged. Astonishing form of racism, actually, that says that, that Muslim girls are somehow damaged. Now that is not, for me, an expression of any kind of progressive or human rights values. Quite apart from the fact that you should not speak about children as having a religion. Adults choose their religion. The idea that there's a Muslim child is nonsense. You mean a child of Muslim parents, any more than you have a socialist child or any other kind of child. So I just think this leads us into really dangerous territory. What we should be stressing are universal values, the shared values of our culture, and among those values, when people arrive here, and they should be welcomed here in large numbers, I'm in favour of higher immigration and higher asylum numbers in this country, they should be welcomed into the very values that most of the time they come here for. You know, you speak to Iranian women who come to this country, they came here precisely to get away from Verdi, who come to Europe. They come here precisely to get away from judges telling them that women are worth less and that women can't be taken further than a camel will travel.
I think most people would agree that the examples you've given from the German courts are alarming, and to think that within, you know, a Western democratic state built on the rule of law and respect for human rights, that apparently there are different laws for different communities or different interpretations of the law, that quite clearly is an affront to the rights of those individuals. I think it's quite useful the way you've drawn a distinction between the way multiculturalism often sees people in terms of communities, not in terms of individuals. So the rights and freedoms of the individual often get subsumed within their community's rights, which, as you say, tend to be dominated by certain stratas, certain powerful hegemonic stratas, and people within those minority communities don't conform. The dissidents, those who dissent from the orthodoxy, they are just left to be, you know, they're vulnerable to the powerful hierarchies
but
within.
The problem, you're completely right, but the particular problem is that multiculturalism puts the state on the side of the reactionary minority who are oppressing the rest. It's worth bearing in mind, in every immigrant community, women and gays are at least 55%. So, you know, we're not talking about a small number of people, we're talking about the majority of people. So, and you're absolutely right, that the problem is multiculturalism actually puts state apparatuses on the side of those people. And most people who...
Well, is it multiculturalism or a particular interpretation?
Well, see, I would say multiculturalism is the idea that society is bisected into different cultures and that the state should encourage people to preserve those cultures. I just think that's inevitably going to... Obviously, this is an extreme interpretation, but I think that inevitably leads to problems. The government should stress shared values. People are naturally going to be diverse. That's a great thing. You know, people are naturally going to, in 1,000 different ways, be different. You know, that's obvious. What the government should be stressing are what we share and the limits of that difference. The limits of that difference are where you begin abusing other people. I don't have a problem with people who, you know, want to celebrate Diwali or, you know, any sort of thing. You know, of course not. I believe in freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, all those things that lead to free religious expression. But that stops where you begin abusing other people.
So why can't we have an interpretation of multiculturalism which defends diversity and the right to be different, providing it's within the framework of universal human rights?
Because universal human rights and multiculturalism militate against each other, as the German example shows. You know, it is simply the case that if you've come from a rural village in Pakistan which has not had a feminist movement and not had a gay rights movement, your culture will have horrendous views towards women and towards gay people. You only need to go to rural Pakistan, as I have, to see how gay people and women are treated there. Now, that is indisputably a culture. Now, within the language of multiculturalism, you cannot critique it. You can only critique it within the language of universal human rights and empower the people within those cultures who are not happy with the situation to fight back. But multiculturalism will always disable progressives trying to side with progressives within immigrant communities. It will always make it harder for them to do it. We need to just move away from the concept. It's not about saying that the people who were in favour of multiculturalism were bad or evil people. They weren't. They believed in it for very good reasons. They wanted to be respectful towards people who came. They wanted to argue against racists on the right who used attacking multiculturalism as an excuse to effectively say immigrants shouldn't be here, and use attacking multiculturalism as a code, effectively. But we need to... The time has come to move beyond it now.
We see it. I've got some considerable sympathy to what you're saying, but I also feel that multiculturalism is an important advance in social evolution. You know, compared to the monocultural character of the society in which I grew up, you know, multiculturalism really is an advance. You know, no longer do we have a society that's so exclusively dominated by the white, the straight, and the male. You know, there is a greater space for women in our culture, a greater space for gay people, a greater space for all kinds of dissent. And I just think that that kind of, you know, interpretation or understanding of multiculturalism is a very positive advance.
You see, I think what you're articulating is the desire of having a diverse and self-determining culture. I don't think that's got anything to do with multiculturalism. Actually, what multiculturalism has done is replicate precisely what you despised in Australia, which is white male dominance in immigrant communities. Actually, if you live in a Muslim area as I do, you'll see that those and I know you spend a lot of time in places that have a large Muslim population. You'll see that actually what multiculturalism has done is help replicate precisely that kind of patriarchal, homophobic culture in miniature. I mean, Amartya Sen gave a good elaboration of the concept of multiculturalism when he said actually what it's become is a kind of plural monoculturalism, where you have individual divided up groups. Rather than, multiculturalism has this nice ring of mixing, you know. That's what I love. I love living in London. I love the fact that we have people from everywhere in the world here in London. I think it's infinitely fascinating. The doctrine of multiculturalism implies that we should separate them out. What I believe, and indeed encourages the practice of separating them out, if you look at the massive encouragement of the proliferation of faith schools in this country, for example, by the current government, an impeccably multiculturalist policy and a catastrophic one.
But I'd say that's a particular reactionary interpretation of multiculturalism. Whereas I'd say my understanding of multiculturalism is to accept the right to be different, to value diversity, but to put limits on it. That, you know, people have a right to be different, providing they don't abuse and harm others. And
So
that simple principle, you know, deals with all the excesses and abuses that you're talking about.
So I don't like the language of a right to be different. I think rights should be very specific and very fixed. A right to free speech is quantifiable, it's comprehensible. A right to assembly, you can see very clearly if it's been breached. A right to difference, I think, is a very vague and quite dangerous concept.
I'll give you an example, you know, to wear a multicoloured Mohican haircut, you know, to be gay or lesbian, to, believe in some minority political or religious viewpoint.
But those are all covered by the right to free speech, the right to assembly, the right, you know... I just think the right to difference is a very dangerous concept because, you know... And it's worth bearing in mind, the very reactionary right, Islamic fundamentalists or Christian fundamentalists, are very eager to use the language of multiculturalism. They constantly use it. Whenever I write an article exposing the profoundly evil attitude of Islamic fundamentalists towards gay people, towards Jews, towards women, you get loads of people saying, how dare you, this is a multicultural country, I have a right to be different. You know. Now, the problem with... So I think the danger of the language you're using is that we end up being impeccably multicultural about people who are aggressively unicultural. And I don't think you can answer those people unless you move away from the frame of multiculturalism. If you go to an imam, Abu Hamza, who I've interviewed, and he says, you know, my culture says you should be dead, you know, or and I should be dead, or we should be killed by having a wall collapsed on us. Unless you ditch the idea of multiculturalism, it's hard to answer him. That is his culture. That is what he believes, sincerely. All you can say is, well, that's a bigoted and disgusting culture, and I disagree with it. And the British state disagrees with it because we're a democracy and we believe in respecting human rights. And tough, mate, you can go and have your culture in a prison cell if you're going to use it to incite the murder of gay people or the imprisoning of women in their homes.
Mm. Well, you know, I hear all that. But in a sense, what I'm trying to do is to rescue all the good bits of multiculturalism, the right to be different, which I hear what you're saying, but I still think, you know, for lesbian and gay people, for example, you know, there's a lot of pressure that we assimilate and conform to heterosexual normative values.
But this has nothing to do with multiculturalism.
You know, that we ape, you know, the heterosexual traditions and patterns. Now, there are obviously good things about heterosexuality and some good heterosexual institutions. I'm not damning them all, but I think also the right to have our own cultural traditions and ways of doing things respected is also important. I mean, take the whole issue of gay cruising. Whether you agree with it or not, the point is, I think if people get satisfaction to go cruising, let them, you know, whether they're gay or straight. So I want to rescue and defend that cultural difference, providing, of course, no one's abused, no one's harmed, everyone's consenting, and people don't cruise in situations that are likely to cause offence to other members of the public.
But Peter, I totally agree. I mean, I'm gay myself. I'm not a fan of cruising, but I totally think there's no problem with it, you know, provided with the provisos that you put. I completely agree with you. But again, I return to the fact that multiculturalism actually helps the people who want to kill people who go cruising. It doesn't protect cruising, it actually protects the people who believe that cruising should be punished by death. You know, I mean, I'll give a good example of a group that I know of, a disgusting group who I know have attacked you, a website called Islamophobia Watch. They believe themselves to be left-wing, they are impeccably multicultural, and anyone like you or me who sides with Muslim gay people or Hindu gay people or Jamaican gay people, they say are racist and should be multicultural and just accept that there are different cultures that hate gays. Indeed, there's a very good example where a colleague of yours, Brett Locke, wrote to them saying, what are you talking about? And they wrote back saying, what is this fuss that gay people have about Sharia law? Why do you keep complaining about it in this Islamophobic fashion? Actually, if you look at the Quran, in order to kill a gay person, you need to have 4 witnesses. How often is that going to happen? Now, within the frame of multiculturalism, it's very hard to answer that. It's very hard to say, well, and how do you object to it?
Well, you know, the way you deal with it is to say that multiculturalism exists within the framework of universal human rights. And at the end of the day, human rights trump cultural diversity if there's a conflict.
But I think what you're doing is you are trying to conflate 2 very different concepts. The minute you take universal human rights and say they need to be counterbalanced by something else, you then, I think, begin on a very dangerous road.
Now, I'm not saying they should be counterbalanced. I'm saying that I think we
they
can...
should be second.
No.
You're saying they should be primary, yeah.
Human rights are first, and within that context, we can tolerate and accept all different kinds of diversities and pluralities, provided they don't breach that fundamental framework of human rights.
We agree, and we're basically just disagreeing about language, what label you give to that particular state of affairs. I just think multiculturalism has become so loaded, has become so associated with failed state patterns, like encouraging faith schools, that we need to abandon the term and talk about diversity within the context of shared values. And the job of the government is not to promote diversity. People are naturally diverse. Indeed, where the government has promoted diversity, it almost always leads to disaster. A good example is if you look at the 2001 riots in Bradford. There was a very good report written by Ted Cantle after this, a civil servant, who talked about how the practice of multiculturalism had led to precisely the opposite of the kind of things, the diversity that you and I like. What it had led to was effectively the ghettoisation of Bradford into different ethnic groups that basically never met. They went to different schools, worked in different workplaces, and didn't know each other. And that's part of what caused the ethnic tinderbox that exploded into the riots. Now, I think that multiculturalism, the situation that created that was multiculturalism. The people in charge were no doubt nice liberal people who said, you know, well, these Muslims, they've got a different culture. OK, we'll put them there. These black people have a different culture. We'll put them there. And I think what the kind of society I want is one where I want to meet black and Asian people and all sorts of different people. You know, I prefer the model of miscegenation rather than multiculturalism, race mixing rather than race separation. And the problem is that what we've got at the moment in Britain, unfortunately under a government that, again, believes it's being benign, they think this is, whenever you ask for their liberal achievements, this is one of the things they trot out, is the expansion of faith schools as being terribly multicultural. Now that has a disastrous effect on human rights. Now, I live very near a Muslim school. I don't have I oppose all faith schools, not just Muslim schools. But I pluck this because it's an example I happen to know. A Muslim school, particularly egregious and disgusting example, where the children spend half the day rote learning the Quran in Arabic, a language they don't speak. Now that, frankly, is simply racist, that we tolerate that. We would not tolerate a Christian faith school that teaches children to rote learn the Bible in Aramaic. We just wouldn't allow it. We would see that we were depriving those children of the chance to be British and to participate in British society. The expansion of faith schools is having all sorts of consequences. If you look at, for example, the impact on gay children, the government has abolished Section 28. That is a great advance. It was a piece of pure prejudice. But by expanding faith schools, Catholic schools, Muslim schools, Hindu schools, Jewish schools, what is it doing? If you have a gay child in a Muslim school or a Catholic school, it comes forward and says to a teacher, you know, I think I might be gay. Is that teacher going to say, fine, no problem with that. You know, it's completely natural. Happens to 5% of people. You know, it's completely fine. Anyone bullies you, we'll stand up to them. I really don't think they are. Indeed, we have evidence they're not doing that. The Catholic schools have refused to comply with the government guidelines on homophobic bullying. And again, I would say, unless we move away from a frame of multiculturalism, we find it very hard to answer that. What we should be arguing for are not multicultural schools, but schools that treat every child as a person. And a 5-year-old is not a member of a Muslim community or a Jewish community. They're a person with rights. Now, they may grow up as an adult to wish to be Muslim or Jewish or Christian. As an atheist, I would argue that they shouldn't. I would encourage them not to. But if they want to do it, of course, that's absolutely should be their right. I'm completely against blocking that right. But you don't work on the assumption that's what they are at the age of 5. You treat them as self-determining adults and help them to realise their own desires and goals.
Well, okay, fine. I can accept a lot of that. I agree that faith schools are storing up big problems for the future because they have encouraged this separation and division based on religion. But you seem to be saying that the binding us together has got to be around shared values.
Yeah.
What I agree, shared values of human rights. But what disturbs me is often that this is, written in terms of Western values or British values.
Absolutely, it's not Western.
Yeah, and I don't like that. I don't think that's necessary or desirable. We have to, I think, create a sense of shared values which are based on universal norms, which can therefore apply to people from all cultures and all backgrounds.
Well, it's grotesquely insulting to say the people of India, to imply that democracy and free speech and human rights are a Western value. They're not. No, I completely agree with you. It's a betrayal of all the people all over the world who I've met in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America, who fight for human rights and democracy and freedom, to imply that democracy and human rights are Western norms. There's a brilliant Iranian feminist called Azar Nafisi who says that, implying that democracy is a Western value, human rights are a Western value, and the culture of Iran is, barbarous, anti-woman, the disgusting views of Ahmadinejad and the Ayatollahs. It's like saying the culture of Massachusetts in 1800 was burning witches. Therefore, we should tolerate the burning of witches in Massachusetts in 2007. It's a ludicrous position. Cultures are dynamic. They're constantly changing. The culture of this country a century ago was to lock gay people in prison, deny women the vote, do all sorts of things that we find abhorrent now. Cultures are constantly changing. Multiculturalism implies that cultures are fixed and homogeneous within an immigrant community. They're not.
I think you've made some very clear points, and I think this whole debate about how we understand and interpret multiculturalism, how it fits together with the broader human rights agenda, how we create a shared value system, a common that reflects our common humanity, that builds bridges between communities and brings us together. Those really are the key issues, I think, for the future. So, Johann, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
And thank you for joining us. And I look forward to you being with us again next week for Talking with Tatchell.